continue on. And whereas the last panel focused a lot on the data infrastructure, we're now going to shift and talk about the physical infrastructure. And John Huntley will begin. He was previously with the Fiscal Studies Unit at the Congressional Budget Office. He's working with us at the Penn Wharton budget model. As I mentioned earlier today, whenever somebody from the Penn Wharton budget model presents, we always want a discussant. And that discussant today will be Mike Parker, who is a partner at the ENY U.S. Infrastructure. In fact, he's the U.S. Infrastructure Advisory Leader and oversees ENY's Infrastructure Advisors, which is an SEC-registered municipal advisor. He has many distinguished industry awards. He's done a lot of stuff on transportation, higher education, telecom. He was previously a co-owner of a company, Jeffrey Parker & Associates, that was then purchased by ENY 2012. And so, John, why don't you take it away?
Very good. Thank you very much, Kent. I'm going to move us now from the fast-moving and dynamic world of cybersecurity to the fast-moving and dynamic world of public infrastructure. Okay. So the Penn Wharton budget model has done a lot of analysis recently on the infrastructure, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about how it works. And basically, when we're doing our analysis, we're trying to answer 4 questions. So we start out by asking ourselves, well, if the federal government gives some aid to state and local governments to build infrastructure, how does that impact the state and local government's budget? To do that, we turn to studies on real-world data of federal aid as well as state and local government budgets to figure out how the state and local governments respond. Okay. Once we know that, once we know how much infrastructure we've built, we actually want to know how productive it is. How much more GDP do we get out of this infrastructure? And again, we turn to a very, very large literature of studies on real-world data about output and infrastructure investments. Once we have these 2 things answered, then we can turn to our model to get some insights about 2 additional questions. First of all, we want to know how infrastructure projects are going to affect the federal budget. And then secondly, we'd like to know how it affects the economy, because that's really what we're interested in. Okay. So I'd like to start talking a little bit about how state and local budgets are affected by federal aid. One of the ways that the federal government can provide aid to state and local governments is basically to directly give it to them. And they often get this aid in the form of block grants or matching grants with caps. Okay? So your block grant is just an amount of aid that's given directly to the states, and it usually does not carry too many restrictions. So if the federal government gave New Jersey $10 billion to build roads, and they built roads, that would be a block grant. A matching grant with a cap or a limit, it doesn't look like a block grant, but it behaves very much like a block grant. So I'll just use as a quick example a build grant. So they may give money to a state, but the state has to provide some effort, some amount of effort. So for example, New Jersey might spend, for every $1 they spend on a road, the federal government may pitch in up to $4. However, these grants are typically limited. So in this particular example, the individual project is limited to about $25 million, and the state is limited to about $150. So there are definitely strong limits. Now, you're going to get new infrastructure built when you issue these grants. Some of the money will find its way into new infrastructure spending. But a more effective way of getting states and local governments to contribute their own money toward infrastructure spending is to develop programs of federal aid that lower the cost of infrastructure spending. And the best examples we have of that right now are tax credits and loan programs. So I'm going to use a quick example of TIFIA, because TIFIA I like because it offers the ability for state and local governments and organizations to borrow money at below market rates. They tend to be able to get the money from the federal government at a rate lower than they could acquire it at on the private market. And that makes building infrastructure cheaper. And state and local governments respond to these sorts of incentives. So how does this work? Let me just use a household finance example, because that's I like to relate everything to household finance. And imagine for a moment that you're going off to Wegmans, and you show up at the grocery store. I like Wegmans a lot. And somebody gives you a $10 gift card. You go out and you do your shopping, you go and get to the register, and what's the first thing you do? You're going to pull out that $10 gift card and pay for it. So you're using the gift card to pay for your groceries. But is your behavior really going to change? Are you going to save that extra $10? Probably. You might use it on going out, going out to eat, pay down some debt, something like that. By contrast, something that lowers the cost is going to change your behavior more. So if you showed up at Wegmans and they gave you a 50% discount card, all of a sudden your shopping experience is going to be very different. You're going to look at that $40 steak, that $40 a pound tenderloin, and think, wow, this is great. This is $20 now. I'm going to get this. The desserts at Wegmans are beautiful. They're even more beautiful at half the price. And you're going to want to spend more money, and when you get to the checkout line, your basket is going to be considerably different than if you didn't have that card. So the literature tells us, studies of real-world data tell us that state and local governments respond to the incentives the same way. Maybe not quantitatively the same, but they do respond to these incentives. Recent Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler, for example, has written on this topic before. And what the studies say is that states, both of these types of programs, you're going to get new infrastructure investment. But if you want state and local governments to contribute more of their own money, you need to lower the cost for these guys. So let's take a little bit of a look here on how much. So let's talk about a couple of different mechanisms. This is just a few examples that we've evaluated over the last few months of types of federal aid and how they impact actual infrastructure being built. And so we turned the literature to develop our range of low, medium, and high. And we're going to start with the block grants and the matching grants with the caps. Those programs are a lot like the gift card you're getting at the grocery store. You're going to spend this money on infrastructure. The question is how much. And the literature has a pretty wide range, but in the middle of it, it's probably going to be about 50 cents. Our range could go from $0 to $1, and it can vary by project, but 50 cents is a good estimate. So what's happening? The federal government is giving $1 of infrastructure aid to a city or a community, and they're turning around, they'll spend that $1, but they're going to say, wow, I feel a little bit richer now. I'm going to take $1 out of my existing, 50 cents out of my existing infrastructure spending and put it towards some other priority. Policymakers, ideally a policymaker, if they're giving out money, wants to get that number to be above $1. That's the goal, is we're throwing some money in, now we want the states to contribute even more so we end up with great big grand projects. But that relies on being able to identify what projects would have been built and what projects would not have been built without the aid. And that's very difficult, and that's what the studies are telling us, is that historically policymakers have not been successful at that. In order to get people to invest more in public infrastructure, we need to give them an incentive, which leads me to the loan programs or the tax credits. The literature is telling us, the studies are telling us, that people are going to spend more if it gets cheaper. It seems to make sense, and that is reflected in our slightly higher range. There are a couple of additional types of federal aid. Well, this one isn't really federal aid, but this is direct spending. So sometimes these infrastructure bills contain money for projects like the national parks or Amtrak. We call this direct spending, and there's not really any state analog to this. So money that gets spent on this is going to end up as, $1 that's spent on direct spending is going to end up being reflected in $1's worth of new infrastructure. Okay. And then one more example that I'd like to offer you. There are several beyond this, but some of the grants are targeted towards distressed communities. So when I'm talking about distressed communities, I mean places with high vacancy rates, they have high property tax delinquency rates, low economic activity, high joblessness. These areas have difficulty getting new money for infrastructure projects. They have a tough time raising additional revenues, and they have a tough time borrowing, at least at competitive rates. In this case, we think that possibly federal funding may stick a little bit more here. These guys they have infrastructure priorities that they need, but they just don't have the means to finance them. So if you give them money, we expect that they might put a little bit more into the infrastructure projects than they would otherwise. However, they can't really go above and beyond because, again, they have trouble raising taxes and borrowing money. So, again, we're capped up at the top of our range of about $1 for these types of grants and aid. Okay. So now that we have a way to actually figure out how much new infrastructure we're getting, we need to know how productive the infrastructure is. There is a very long literature, a lot of studies of real-world data on output and infrastructure investment, and there are a lot of different answers. It varies by project and it varies by approach. We looked to the middle of the range of answers that the real-world studies give us here, and we come up with an answer of about 10%. So if you invest in a bridge or something like that, it's going to pay you back, everything else being equal, about 10% per year. And these things last a long time. So we're talking about 10% year after year after year. By contrast, in our model, you can look at private capital, and the return is about 6%. So those are like computers and trucks and buildings, things that are privately owned return about 6% per year. So our public capital is going to be a little bit more productive than our private capital, which seems, again, it's in the middle of our range, and it seems like a sensible answer. Okay. So now that we have the tools, we'd like to talk about a couple infrastructure plans that we're evaluating. Earlier this year, the White House released its infrastructure plan, and I guess a month or 2 months later, the Senate Democrats issued their own plan. Okay, so the White House plan was about $200 billion, and most of it was allocated toward block grants, matching grants with caps, and there are some other loan programs and small subsidies in there as well. We used the procedure I've described earlier to sort of evaluate how much actual new total infrastructure will be built and come up with about $125 billion. That's our middle of our range. And that's what I'm going to use in the analysis going forward. Okay. The White House plan does not explicitly provide a method for financing this plan. However, they do emphasize that most of this aid will be directed toward projects that develop new sources of revenue. So in this case, we choose to model these as user fees. Think of them like tolls that you're going to pay when you're riding on a freeway that's been built. This is how we're going to pay for these things. And user fees have one advantage. They're more efficient or more effective at raising money than some other distortionary taxes. So user fees don't do things like affect your take-home pay or your returns to investment. And so they're not directly going to affect your choice or a household's choice of whether to work or save. So in that case, there are going to be fewer negative economic consequences from using user fees than there might be from using other types of taxation. By contrast, we have the Senate Democrat plan. It is much larger. It's about $1 trillion, and it's spread over a similar mix of programs, mostly matching grants with caps. There are some loan programs, subsidies, tax credits, and direct spending. Again, applying the previous methodology, we end up with about $630 billion of new infrastructure. Again, it's about a little more than 5 times the White House plan. Unlike the White House plan, the Senate Democrats do provide for revenues to finance their program. They call for about $1 trillion in additional, in higher tax rates on both personal and corporate income. Okay, with that background, I'd like to talk a little bit about what happens and how our analysis works here. So let me start with the White House plan, which begins with about $125 billion of new infrastructure capital. Let's start on the left side, which is the left panel, which is the plan funded by user fees, and we have 2 different bars that we got. The blue bars are the 2032, so that's 15 years out, and then the orange bars are 25 years out. And you can see they're all very small. That's very deliberate, as we're going to compare this to the Senate Democrat plan. This is a small plan. Okay. So on the leftmost column here, we have GDP. You notice you can't see a whole lot. That's because GDP is not changing a whole lot. It goes up a tiny, tiny bit, but ultimately rounds to 0. 2 things are affecting GDP, and they're pulling it in opposite directions. First, we have public capital that's going up by 0.6% in 15 years from now. So when $125 billion in public capital is not enormous, I think as Mike is going to show in a little bit, our current total public capital stock is somewhere in the order of $10 trillion. I apologize if I just wrecked one of your main talking points there. But it's going to be even bigger in 2032. So $125 billion is not a huge increase in the capital stock. So we're talking about 0.6%. Offsetting that, on the other side, is a slight decrease in private capital from the general economic effects and the taxes here. So the negative private capital is pulling down GDP, and these two effects offset each other, and basically there's a very, very small positive effect in the end. The rest of the economy is effectively unchanged. Debt, well, the program is paying for itself with its user fees, so we don't get any more debt, and average wages and hours worked don't change at all either. The story is effectively the same in 2042. It's just that the public capital is even bigger, the economy is even bigger, so our investment is looking even a little bit smaller. Moreover, our investment is slowly beginning to depreciate out as these projects get a little bit older and a little bit less useful. As potholes start accumulating on these bridges, the traffic's not going to move as fast, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, the net effect is pretty much the same. Okay. Now I'd like to highlight the right panel, which is the same plan, the same infrastructure plan, the same amount, except this time it's being financed with deficits. And it's not that they propose this, but I want to show you how deficits affect these plans. Again, we have the positive pull of public capital, which is exactly the same, but now we have a little bit a significantly larger decrease in private capital. Private capital goes down 0.2% in 2032 and nearly 0.5% in 2042. Well, why is that? It's because debt is going up. We had to issue debt, and as Kent showed earlier and talked about earlier, debt is crowding out private capital. So in this case, and as time goes on, the effect is snowballing and crowding out more and more private capital. So the negative effect from private capital in our analysis is bigger now than the positive effect from public capital. And we end up with a drop in GDP of 0.1%. And even though it says 0.1% in 2042, that is a little bit larger. They both just round to the same place. So the lesson here is that user fees are a more effective way of generating GDP with an infrastructure plan than our higher deficits. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to the Senate Democrat plan. Now I'd like to turn to the Senate Democrat infrastructure plan. The first thing you notice about this is that it's much bigger. But ultimately, the story is very similar. So we have $630 billion in worth of new infrastructure capital, which is a positive pull on GDP. And again, we have a loss in private capital, which is a negative pull in GDP. So in 2032, the effect on GDP roughly nets out. But by 2042, it's a little bit bigger. Well, why is that? When the Senate Democrats raise money for their plan, they're using these distortionary taxes. And although we assume that they're only 10 years long, so they've since expired by the time you're looking at this graph, their effects live on. Over those 10 years, their higher personal taxes and higher corporate taxes drive down savings and work effort just a little bit. And that is reflected in lower GDP, which leads to lower tax revenues. So in the end, their revenues are not paying for the full cost of the infrastructure plan, and they're piling up a little bit of debt. And you can see how that happens in the fourth pair of bars there. Debt in 2032 is about a percentage point higher than it would be in a world without a plan. And that has a drag on private capital. The one other thing I'd like to note is that private capital going down also tends to lower average wages. So it's going to make people paid a little bit less. You take away my computer, I'm not going to be able to run these simulations or slides, and that's going to make me a little bit less useful. You know, the jury's still out on that, but that's what most of us think. But that's going to lower my pay, and that's going to be reflected economy-wide as people become less productive. Okay. Now, on the right panel, I'm showing the same plan but financed with higher deficits. Again, the Senate Democrats did not propose this, but we just wanted to highlight the difference between these two financing methods. So this is the same story as we had under the White House infrastructure plan. The infrastructure is pulling positively, but now we have an enormous amount of debt, which is about 4% higher in 2032. And that is really dragging down our economy. So in 2032, we've lost more than 1% of private capital, and by 2042, we're nearly down to 2.5% of private capital. This is a very big negative effect on GDP. It's reflected in significant losses in both GDP and in average wages. So the important thing to know is even though we're using distortionary taxes to finance, the Senate Democrats are using distortionary taxes to finance their infrastructure plan, financing with deficits is still much worse, and that's exactly what I think Kent showed earlier in his analysis of the tax plans. So with those lessons, I'd like to conclude by talking about what makes for an effective infrastructure plan. And I think there are two key features here that will make for an effective infrastructure plan generally. The first is that we need to lower the cost of infrastructure investment for states, local governments, and in some cases private entities. We need programs that lower the cost, and the ones we have now are like tax credits and loan programs. We want them to invest more. The second thing is we want to use the most effective tax that we can, and we like user fees. If those aren't available, the next most effective tax are distortionary taxes. The choice that causes the largest drop in GDP is using deficits to finance these, because these are always going to crowd out private capital, and in almost all circumstances will crowd out the gains you get, the higher productivity gains you get from public infrastructure. And just to make this point, we considered a $500 billion hypothetical plan that adhered to these principles. So firstly, it's funded by user fees. And then secondly, it's just loan programs and tax credits, things that lower the cost of public infrastructure. We find that in sum, over 15 years, that we have an increase in GDP of about 1.5%. So that's the total effect over all 15 years. And that increases to nearly 3% 25 years from now. So adhering to these two principles is one of the more important components to designing an effective infrastructure plan that has lasting positive effects on GDP. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Great. Well, thank you all for the chance to share some thoughts with you, and to Kent and to the Wharton team and Kimberly for setting this up, and for John for really setting the stage. It's very gratifying for me to be able to talk to you today, in part as a Wharton alum, but also as a practitioner in this field, but also as a user of infrastructure. And one of the fun parts about working in this field is that it's very tangible. And when we achieve success on the project, we can point to it. And in fact, at the same time, all of us are sort of infrastructure experts. And so I grew up in D.C., actually watching the metro be built on Wisconsin Avenue, and then riding it out to National Airport and watching the planes take off as a fun activity for an 8-year-old. My son will be taking the Green Line in Philly to high school next year, and when I'm down July 4th weekend in Nashville with my in-laws, they're going to be talking about traffic and investment, and these are folks who never talk about paying for any sort of public infrastructure, but it's going to be a big deal for them, and it continues to be. So, in a sense, the U.S. is not like many other countries, though. Sometimes people are asking me, and even in our firm, we'll be talking at a board level, when's the infrastructure spending going to start? But the U.S. actually has a tremendous lead, or it has had a tremendous lead, I should say, in infrastructure. And in fact, we're benefiting from the foresight and investment of earlier generations. There were public and private investments from the Transcontinental Railroad to the subway system to the National Highway System, water, electrical grid. This underpinned a period of remarkable growth and growth in productivity, as well as quality of life. But right now, many of our iconic facilities do require reinvestment, and in some cases, reimagining. And in newly growing cities like Nashville, there's a need for a first generation of infrastructure, or really a much more expanded generation. So this presents some challenges, but also opportunities. And part of what I'd like to talk to you about briefly now is sort of level setting where we are in the U.S., but then some of the questions that you might ask, including what is the effect on GDP, as you consider new infrastructure programs. So right now, you can see, and first of all, I know there's some folks obviously from CBO in the audience, so thank you for the data. We're passing it back to you, and know that there's those out there in the world who are consuming it. So as I said, maybe starting actually on the right side, if you look at the amount of construction being put in place in the U.S. infrastructure, and we've made some assumptions about what the definition of that is for office, for healthcare, for residential, for commercial. We took out the private sector, but for communication, we've left it in. And we're over $400 billion of new construction being put in place. At the same time, if we start looking at real spending using infrastructure-specific inflation indices, we've been in decline relative to, and we've been in decline in particular as operations and maintenance go up. And that's probably not surprising, right? If you don't maintain something well, it starts to need more operations and maintenance investment. And if you look back in time to that earlier dip, there was a time my grandparents on my dad's side were first-generation immigrants, and we were going out to Brooklyn to visit them. And it was a noteworthy story in our family when I asked my dad if we could wait for the next train on the New York City subway, because at the time, the one that had come had graffiti and was not in the best of shape. Of course, that was every train, and so we got on, and that was that. But now we're starting to experience that. And even here in Washington, D.C., you have the transit system that I was comparing the New York City one to, but that was conceived in the 50s. It was built over 40 years ago. We also, though, on the O&M side, it's an interesting management problem, too, because we should be able to improve our performance of how we manage and operate our infrastructure. So when we think about also the effects of infrastructure on the economy, sometimes sentiment is a useful indicator. Sometimes not everybody, just because you're leading a company, means that you actually have a sense of how macroeconomics works, and things can be counterintuitive, as John was just showing, I think, for many folks. But when we survey about 2,500 corporate executives twice a year, and we started asking them about infrastructure this time. And so the first question we asked was, will government spending impact your growth plans over the next 12 months? And 78% of global executives said yes, it was important or critical to their growth rate, about 64% of U.S. Interestingly, we also asked them what their expectations were for government infrastructure spending over the next 12 months. And you would think this is something pretty easy to have a clear sense on, given that infrastructure takes a while. So 75% of global executives felt that their government was going to increase infrastructure spending, about 59% of U.S. And maybe this is less surprising. It's not just that people have different policy views or different understandings of the world, but actually in the U.S., most of infrastructure, unlike in many other countries, is owned at the local level. And most spending occurs at the local level, and decisions to spend. And so we're seeing it's not really even a red state or blue state thing. Los Angeles just incrementally increased the spending on infrastructure. LA Metro alone, just that transportation agency, by $100 billion has passed a new measure, which is their fourth measure. So it's incremental. At the same time, Georgia has done that, and so you have Metro Atlanta has a new $11 billion program. State of Tennessee, state of Pennsylvania, Virginia, numerous have taken different types of actions. But it might not be surprising that U.S. residents or executives in different parts of the country might feel that different things were happening. We talk about how states view spending and where the federal program fits within that. It's also important to see that we're in a different world, and it's a world of more devolution than historically. Federal funds are only about 28%, maybe less, depending on how we're counting private finance and public-private partnerships, of state infrastructure at this point. I should point out also that state bond proceeds, in a sense, aren't really funding, but if you're putting together a project to build tomorrow, they are a source of funds, but they do have to be paid back, and so they're quite different. So we're very different from other countries in that sense also, in that our states and localities do borrow, and they have the ability to do so, and often efficiently through the tax-exempt market. So as we start to turn to how we're going to reinvest in infrastructure or increase our spending, asking better questions we think is a great framework. And it's part of why I'm thrilled to be part of this panel and this event today, because I think we can argue about what the goals are, but we do want to make sure that we're creating programs that have that implementation and that have that result. So my background is more working directly with projects and with states and localities or private companies that are developing new projects. And so there also can be a gulf between the macro policy level and what happens on the ground. But at the same time, sometimes anecdotally, we miss the forest through the trees. So I would submit to you that the first 3 questions that anyone should ask about a program can be fairly straightforward. Will it lead to a net increase in domestic infrastructure investment? And I really wrote this without coordination with John, but that, you know, there's the question that we need to ask if that's the intention. Will that new investment, if we have it, go to projects that are worthwhile? And then, assuming we've picked projects that are worthwhile, will they be completed and maintained, and will they perform the way that we expect them to? So, let me head back here for a second. So will the program lead to a net increase in domestic infrastructure investment? Changes in how we or who manages or funds infrastructure, even this discussion of should it be federal or should it be state and local, right? These can change incentives. We can have discussions about public-private partnerships. We can reallocate risks, and that can create powerful results. But it doesn't necessarily lead to greater or more worthwhile investment. It could be more productive or less. And so you could ask questions like, will that program attract and reward or displace investment from states and cities? But also, can it be relied upon by CFOs who are managing their debt capacities? If they're planning for the infrastructure for the next 10 years, how will they view that program? Or are we overstating the benefit of a program, even a tax credit program, but it's complicated? Or is the juice worth the squeeze? Or will it just change who invests rather than how much, at least at the macro sense? Or will a program actually make an impact in the next 2 to 5 years? Infrastructure projects take a little while to develop and certainly to construct. So if we create a new program, the program set up in the time even just to choose a project could significantly impact the benefit of it. So poor investment decisions also, if we pick the wrong projects, will limit the benefits of the program. And not every project, even aligned to the right goal, will best meet its objectives if it's not a well-conceived project. And then, in fairness, not everyone really shares the same sense of objectives either. So, meanwhile, we are increasingly able to understand our infrastructure as part of a wider system and environment community. So, when we're thinking about new programs, we could ask, is there a transparent approach to allocating spending? If decision-making is required, is it at the appropriate level of government? I don't think anyone who's had practical experience in the field would ever suggest that these are things that should be taken off in a corner, that there's not a political dimension to them. But if funding is going to be awarded, and if that's a federal role, will it be predictable? And will it be a complex process to get it? Is there a way that the program can be designed to readily identify or to bring forward credible projects, and can they then be certain that they will get it? If a state goes out and passes a new gas tax or raises it, do they have any assurance that the federal partner will be there? And does the program, is it cutting across silos sufficiently, given how we now understand our systems as networks? Likewise, does it encourage the performance of a network? In Philadelphia, we have a tremendous bones of the infrastructure system. Some of it built in the 18th, 19th century or 20th century. If that system operated 30% more efficiently, if the trains ran 30% more quickly, more often, that could have a huge ROI. Can we capture that, or are we just thinking about expansion? And so, lastly, we build these projects. How do we know that they're going to be completed on time and on budget? Will public confidence be undermined if they're not? Will they be inefficient? Were they a good investment at one price but not at another? And in fact, the confidence to keep investing is probably undermined if the initial projects are poorly planned or delivered. So and when we see in private industry, the reality can be that depending on how we contract, there can be limited incentives or even disincentives for the parties involved to estimate well, to control cost and schedule, or even to design the project to perform optimally over its life. So how will a new program address those kinds of questions? And are there ways to assure results and long-term accountability without burdensome oversight, especially if the federal role is a much smaller percentage of a project than it was historically? So I think we want to allow some time for questions, and I think I would just close by saying that from our perspective, a renewed commitment to funding infrastructure does create an opportunity to conceive new programs and to think again about these types of issues. And demonstrating that we can think through them carefully might in fact be crucial to earning the confidence needed to secure investment, or at least continued investment. And so I think lastly, there's a bigger picture to consider. As we renew our infrastructure, do we aspire just to rebuild? Are new technologies or demographic changes or the potential for new business models and a better understanding of our needs, can that too shift what we build and how we build it? So thank you, and we look forward to the discussion.
All right. We got a lot of questions. This is one of those topics that generates a lot of interest for us. And so I'm going to be going a little rapid fire. So a couple of you said you also want to use the microphones as well. Feel free to do that. Let me go through a couple of these cards first, and then I'll go to the microphones. So the first one, John, is clearly directed to you for your presentation, and that is, so the high rate of return of public capital, the 10% that you mentioned, much higher than the return to the private capital, which was 6%. And so the question is asking is if there are, is this due to the fact that there's a lower stock of public capital? There's diminishing returns and therefore high marginal productivity because of the lower stock of public capital relative to private capital. And so if there are these diminishing marginal returns, how much would you expect significant increases in public investment to reduce the marginal rate on public capital? So you could almost think about one of the Republican or the Democrat plan, for example, how much did that 10% come down as you boost up public capital?
I think that's a fantastic question. So yes, there's a lot of news and information about how our public capital is sort of lagging behind. So I think there is some dimension on which the stock of public capital is a little bit lower, which makes the productivity of it, the productivity of an additional dollar a little bit higher. I also like to think of it as a comparison to private capital. You know, if you're a business and you see a business opportunity there that pays a little bit more than the marginal product of capital, you're getting a little better return, you're going to jump on it. Mm-hmm. But the public sector doesn't really work that fast. It takes a very long time for these things to build. They can be in the pipeline for a very long time. So that may mean that there's some effective projects out there that have not yet been realized.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the second part of this question is, do I expect it to go down? Yes, absolutely. But I think there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in the projects themselves. So some things are naturally more worthwhile than others. And furthermore, even the Senate Democrat plan at $600 billion is only 6% of the entire U.S. capital stock. That's not an enormous amount. And by the time they're finished building all of that, the U.S. public capital stock would be bigger anyway. So it's going to be an even smaller amount. So yes, it would go down. I don't know exactly by how much, but you know, I'm just trying to keep it in perspective and note that it's a pretty small plan.
All right, and related to that, and this is maybe also from Michael, is talking about you just mentioned the heterogeneous kind of return to different types of projects. That 10% is kind of an average, but there's a lot of heterogeneity around that. So the question is, you know, in fact, if the benefit to cost ratio varies significant between, for example, road widenings, and that may only increase travel or decrease, I think they meant to write, travel time without additional safety, or you know, various other benefits versus projects that will improve, for example, jobs or improve safety. There are these different returns, and of course, the model incorporates the fact that you have this high marginal productivity of public capital, and still you get the results that you get. But there's a lot of heterogeneity around that. So, so you talked a lot about how to finance, and then the mechanism that what type of taxes you use versus distorting taxes, and then of course how to incentivize the states to kick in more. But this is really a question that's more focused on project selection. So, Michael, I think, you know, talking about that heterogeneity, what would you say are kind of the big ROI, you know, projects? Are they more on repairs, or are they more on, what are the big ROI type things?
So I do think that infrastructure is local, and the needs in different places are commensurately local. And there are different types of social returns as well as purely economic returns. I realize in a room of economists, we can find different ways of quantifying or thinking about that. So I think there are some programs, there are some projects that are just taking care of what we have, and preventative maintenance actually, which is something we haven't been doing, can be very high ROI in a long-term sense. But in terms of some specific projects, we can start to see that I think really, in my mind, the question of why we want the states and locals to spend versus the federal is not fully answered by this sort of macro analysis. And so we can talk about what would be an incentive for the state or local to spend. To me, for example, if there's state and local participation in a project, it's a good signal at a certain level, or there's private participation in the project, that the project has merit to somebody and otherwise, and it's less of a likely to be a bridge to nowhere. So I think that's sort of a different and more interesting point to me in some cases than when it comes to finding ways to get to project selection.
In fact, you and I have talked in the past about the irony about that, in the sense that if, from the federal government's perspective, the state and local has more interest in a particular project, probably indicative that it's a higher ROI project. At the same time, it's also probably indicative they would have been spending money on that project as well. And so then the offsets things become.
But I think recognizing we're having discussions of budget model, in some ways I'm thinking about more as a national policy.
Sure.
And so if we need the project needs to get done.
Sure.
And so whether or not they would have done it or someone else, the question is, as a country, do we do it? And so that idea of finding efficient ways to have project selection and to resolving what also you cannot ignore that there is a political set of trade-offs that have to happen to get a project of scale to
Let me go to the microphone. If you could identify yourself and your question. Yep. Yep.
Assuming it's financed by borrowing, and you have GDP falling, which seems to imply that there's greater than 100% crowding out. That is, we're going to borrow $200 billion. We're going to build infrastructure. The $200 billion then is not available to the private sector. So the private sector can't build private sector capital. It doesn't seem like GDP would fall.
Yes, that is a very technical question. So there are a couple of issues in there. So what I showed you up on the chart there is just 2 years really. It's 2032 and 2042. So the government is spending money on this in some ways faster than the infrastructure is coming online. And so we're actually running up a little bit of debt earlier, and then that's having a snowball effect. So we're actually crowding out even additional, Kent showed earlier that we're actually crowding out additional public capital in addition to the $200 billion worth that we're borrowing. Because there are negative economic effects that are not being offset by the positive infrastructure spending nearly as fast. The second thing is that the public infrastructure, even though it may have a high productivity, remember, we've lost some of this. Some of the states have taken their infrastructure budget and they've allocated it to other state spending, for example. And so we're not getting the full blast of, we're not getting 10% on that whole $200 billion.
Okay, I get the second. I'm not sure I understand the first point, but I get that.
Okay.
I get the second point. So we're not getting the full $100 billion.
Yeah, we're not getting the benefit of $200 billion worth of public infrastructure. We're getting the benefit of $125 billion.
The model must have private investment must be very sensitive to interest rates in the model.
I'm going to defer to Kent to the exact elasticity of public investment with respect to interest rates, but yes, it is sensitive to interest rates.
Private investment.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it is. I mean, and we use the standard elasticity of savings from the literature from that. But there's two things. One is that offset that you're creating debt of $200 billion, but you're not getting a total spend of $200 billion. You're getting the offset. But the second one is that this is partly the timing issue. There's a time to build function in there. It takes a while to ramp up the infrastructure. And then as a result of that, you're accumulating, it's not just $200 billion of debt. It's actually, by the time it gets ramped up, it's $200 billion of increased primary debt, but then there's interest that's debt service that snowballs on top of that. So by the time the public infrastructure is actually ramped up, it's not just $200 billion of debt, it's $200 billion of debt plus debt service. So it's really those two things that are happening.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So with the infrastructure, another question that, from the card is, it says, for infrastructure projects funded with private sector participation, what kind of firms or entities have been the main private sector participants? I think this is probably best for Mike.
Sure. So there's a spectrum, because sometimes when we talk about infrastructure projects, to begin with, we may be thinking about new construction projects. And so that is a category. There's also significant trends of private capital investing in either privately owned or publicly owned infrastructure that's existent. And so within the spectrum of public-private partnerships, we see a mix of vertically integrated construction firms as well as specialty private equity shops, and increasingly some public pension funds starting to be willing to fund into those. However, a lot of the sort of more direct investors we see looking more for established projects that have revenue streams that are proven, that don't have construction risk associated with them, and that have a cash flow that's immediate. And so there's also some movement where there's a secondary market, and there's some specialists who work on the development of projects, and then others who work long term. We are seeing that type of vertically integrated investment from contractors, from now domestic contractors. Historically, about 15 years ago, there was a much greater preponderance of international as well. We should also mention, though, that certain types of infrastructure are by country as to whether or not that overall category of infrastructure is public or private. So utility investment, which is a very significant type of infrastructure, or oil and gas midstream infrastructure, or others, or telecom in the U.S. are undertaken clearly through a mix of corporate strategic investors and private equity. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Well, it's a lot of the utilities, the telecom. How much hedge fund action have we seen in this space? Or do you see a lot of public-private partnerships? You see some outside the U.S., but what about inside the United States? So I guess sort of depends on your definition of hedge fund, which itself can encompass a lot. But I think we would see more pure private equity, and then some pension funds in some countries that have the governance to undertake direct investment. We're talking about on the equity side. Of course, infrastructure lends itself to debt, because typically it's a much more, to the degree it has a revenue stream associated with it, it's often a longer, more predictable one. And so the pool of debt investors, in fact, of course, much U.S. infrastructure is financed with tax-exempt debt. And so I think there's a broad spectrum there. The true hedge fund activity we've seen has actually been more around distressed assets and coming in, repositioning them, and then selling out. Yeah, and it relates to your debt a point. I grabbed the question here. I think this is probably more for John. It says, you emphasize how negative deficit financing is, but if we run federal deficits in order to develop infrastructure, cannot that actually be good, or no worse in general than tax increases to pay for infrastructure?
Well, I think that today, right now, when we're doing these analysis based on today's economic conditions, and I think that's the lesson that we're learning, is that using debt to finance these things, it doesn't pay for themselves. They don't pay for themselves. Is that we need to finance a way, even if it may be distortionary. Using distortionary taxes is a more efficient way to implement these programs than using deficit financing. Yeah,
and I think there's a distinction between economics, the macro effects, versus kind of generational equity. In some sense, one can make the argument for deficits that, hey, future generations are ones benefiting from it. They should help pay for it through deficits. But that's different than macro effects, where, for ceteris paribus, for amount of infrastructure, how do you actually want to get that?
Yeah, John, I think also I would say, noting some of our clients in the state and local world and in government, as they've seen your analysis, some of the questions they would have around this also, well, are fuel taxes user fees in your view? Are they, or is that general revenue? And many cases when we do talk about state and local governments committing, it can be sticky, and it can be sticky at the federal level too, because these can be lockbox revenue streams. They're not all general spending.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I think those are some questions that people have had.
Sure, and let me go to the microphone over here. And if you could state
Okay.
your name or where.
Bernardo Weaver, I work at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. on PPPs and project finance.
Nice.
So I have two questions, actually, and for John, but Mike can also talk about them. So first, like, I don't understand how the return on private investment infrastructure can be lower than the public investment, because in general, the private sector will be more savvy in looking for projects with higher IRRs, right? And the projects with a higher social return to be pursued by the government. That would be the first. And the second, something that you mentioned that, like, in order to produce economic growth, it would be ideal to invest in projects that had more revenues from the project itself, like toll roads, the example you gave, right? So usually those projects, they're projects that address wealthier clientele, right? Like wealthier sections of the country that can pay higher tolls, because usually in a toll road, you can like support OPEX, but it would be harder to support CapEx, right? Unless you're in a very expensive, wealthy area of the country. And the role of the government in many instances is to develop social welfare, right? And to reduce poverty. And so how could we tackle those projects if they rely much more on increasing taxes or issuing more debt, which you showed as problematic according to the two government plans that you showed from the Democrats and Republicans?
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
Okay, well, to answer your first question, I just want to clarify that it's public infrastructure. I actually mean all infrastructure projects in here are 10%. So it's just, when I said that 6% is private capital, I meant that's private, like completely private. There's no public component of that.
Like a factory.
So, I'm sorry?
Like
like a factory or a computer or something like that. So yes, I agree with you on point number one, absolutely. I mean, in the second one, you know, this is a broad level analysis of the plans that were proposed by the Senate Democrats and by the White House. I mean, there's an enormous amount of flexibility in designing the particular types of user fees and the or even distortionary taxes that may be used to finance these programs that can accomplish any number of the goals that you had listed. So, you know, you shouldn't feel restricted. You know, I've listed a hypothetical program funded with user fees. I mean, there's a whole broad range of options there that we have not analyzed, and we'd be happy to analyze individually as those plans come out. But you should never feel restricted to just those options that we listed above there.
And I think this is, you know, maybe one of the reasons that I wouldn't. This is pure speculation, but that public projects can have a higher return if properly chosen. Is sometimes there can be, you know, a private activity can extract rent, or even a toll road, if priced to maximize revenue, you know, could actually end up degrading the quality of service, say, on free roads that are nearby, or causing other externalities. And so if the government occasionally is in a position to determine sort of the way to get the best sort of bang for the buck out of that infrastructure, it's not always by extracting the most charge for that particular piece of infrastructure.
Right. And I just want to piggyback off something Mike said there. It's, you know, if they're charging very high tolls on the highway, in some ways that defeats the purpose of putting up public infrastructure. I mean, if they're revenue maximizing, then the toll road is going to be underused, and it's going to have lower productivity than it would as if you were tolling to maximize usage. And so that's always a consideration too. User fees have to be designed effectively to accomplish the goals that the policymaker is trying to push.
Yeah, and you also keep in mind we're talking about equilibrium outcomes here, and I know that gets a little jargony, but it's exactly your first point. Private sector guys are picking off the high ROI projects, and so what gets left is, you know, the 6% in equilibrium, whereas the public one, it's hard to, if that's subject to some type of public goods free riding problem in terms of private provision of a public good, those could actually be generating high ROI, and it's hard for the private sector to pick those off.
So,
It has to be really quick because I want to get through some other questions.
Just to finish that.
Yeah.
So then, but the conclusion states that, in order to invest in projects that are more socially relevant and that will have a smaller toll revenue, you end up more likely running into deficits or increasing taxation, right?
Yeah, I mean, you just have to think about the projects as a whole, I think. You know, all of your objectives and then tailor the particular tax plan to achieve whatever your objectives are.
All right, we have about 6 minutes left, so I want to run through these kind of rapid fire here. I feel like I'm on my Sirius XM.
Got somebody up as well.
Oh, okay. I'll be right there.
I'm going to get to my question, so I'll sit down if you have.
What's that? All right. I will try to. I feel like I'm doing my Sirius XM radio show, coming close to the hour, trying to get all these things in. Can you clarify this for John? The low, medium, high spending scenarios. You had the zero response for grants. I think that was on the low end. This person said that it seems low. Gramlich and Thaler estimated, closer to 1/3. I think that was one of the middle estimates. But at the same time, the tax credit response seems high. The DOT had a hard time giving away $1 billion in TIF funds.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the literature has a vast range of estimates. The low represents, a couple studies on the low, and the high represents a couple studies on the high. Granted, the loans and the tax credits are a bit thinner. It's difficult to figure out exactly what the elasticity is, but there's one particularly good paper that does show that there is a strong response to costs, and it's one of my favorite studies of real world, and it looks at water projects in California, and it was done by a Wharton professor, Bob Inman, and then it shows that state and local governments really do respond. There are loan programs and tax credit programs that are not structured in such a way to lower the cost. Maybe they're too small, or they may have other features that don't make them that don't end up being reflected in a lower price for the next marginal.
No, I think that's Hey, bottom line comes from. You can leave your mic on. Bottom line comes from the literature, but the results you are presenting were from the middle.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think just it really is important to see that there can be tax credit programs that people need to hire firms like us to go monetize the tax credits, and by the time you're done with the efficiency of the program, it's not necessarily an efficient program. And the same thing on the loan side. It can take a year or two to negotiate a loan.
Yeah.
The project's benefits are being delayed, and so you can see that some of these types of things that are self-liquidating. And I don't think that municipal debt is always the right answer, but the tax-exempt debt markets are efficient here as an example of where you've actually just lowered the cost.
Yeah. This question: why do you assume the Trump plan or the White House plan would be financed with user charges when it allows for any state and local, I assume, government? Including new taxes or debt. I think it was basically saying states will have some flexibility in how to come up with their share of it.
Using the text of the document, they're emphasizing projects that are producing new types of revenues. Admittedly, they don't have to exclusively be user fees. They could be other things. We picked that because it seems sensible, and it was in line with historical example.
Yeah, and you also did the deficit finance one as well. And that was really a focus on the federal share of it there. But so if you could only pass projects with user fees, and socially important projects in low-income areas will never be made. Hence, it will continue to sacrifice the poor, increase the income gap. So, how do you build, poor, kind of end infrastructure? And that, I think, Mike, you go first with that, and then John.
So, I'm also always cognizant of being the sort of practitioner who's working with communities to get projects done, and I think we want to make sure that we're having this dialogue where you see don't miss the forest through the trees. But I think clearly there is an important role for projects, and the point of them can be, in fact, to maximize usage of them. And that can be true in a number of dimensions, whether it's infrastructure or otherwise, and the outcomes for public health or for safety or overall economic development can be very significant. And so I think clearly there does need to be a balance. And I think that kind of question around, is a fuel tax a user fee? Or how are we thinking about user fees? Is it really always about a toll or about the maximum choice? But I think clearly sales taxes also at the state and local level are very common. And frankly, the infra grant program from the administration really is showing that some of the projects they're positioning or awarding grants to are ones that are implementing new taxes or new sales taxes. So I think we are seeing that.
Yeah. And what you see in the analysis that John presented too is that in those types of programs, that's where you don't get a big state offset because they wouldn't have been spending money on that. So you get this trade-off where you may use a more inefficient thing like a distorting tax. On the other hand, the states aren't able to offset a lot of that. So by how much do the credit programs and loan guarantees in your proposal lower state, and just be clear, it wasn't a proposal, I think you were doing analysis, but how much do credit programs and loan guarantees in the last example that you did lower state and local borrowing costs relative to tax-exempt bonds?
This might actually be a better question for Mike.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the project, and it actually depends on the implementation of the program. So just as an example, worked on a project that applied for a TIFIA loan. We brought 2 credits to the TIFIA office, 2 deal structures. Both were rated BBB-. One of them had a $50 million NPV higher cost to the state than the other. The TIFIA program, the way it chose the higher one. And that there were some reasons from a policy standpoint that they wanted to go there. But I think it would not have had a $50 million increase in the credit subsidy cost from a federal budget side. So I think there can be a wide spread. One of the things I'd also talk about is who's spending the money. And a program like TIFIA can also equalize the cost of capital if you have some distortion where we actually are subsidizing tax-exempt debt, but for a certain project, the private sector taking the risk of something happening or guaranteeing its performance would jeopardize the tax exemption. TIFIA, in some cases, is just leveling the playing field between these two, but it might allow for a more efficient project delivery or to pay for a project, and this doesn't get to the macro point, but some projects don't happen because you don't have the cash on that day to do it. And so a lot of states having that flexibility to pay over time is important. But the cost between tax-exempt and taxable fluctuates, and the benefit for TIFIA is actually that there's no change in the cost for a lower credit rating. So you can actually finance more risk without paying up for it, and that can be hundreds of basis points. If it's purely just a perfect, AAA muni versus a taxable federal, start getting closer.
So how difficult is it to predict problems, if I'm reading this correctly? The way I'm interpreting this question is a lot of times infrastructure is to deal with natural disasters. And so in particular, you might want to incorporate the fact that there could be these shocks because we don't have good, drainage systems and, things like that. How do maybe think about from E&Y's perspective or your perspective in the practice, how do you think about that when you're talking with state and local governments, federal governments? How do you quantify kind of it's not just the expected outcome that matters, it's really the variance.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of nascent effort around resilient infrastructure and figuring out what does that even mean, and is it infrastructure, the whole network, and this is actually the discussion on cyber and the one we're having now start to converge. What does it mean to have a resilient network? And that's a little bit different than resiliency infrastructure like a seawall that you build that's only purpose is for that. And so there is a significant body of activity going on to encourage greater thinking when we're building something for it to function in multiple ways and to be more resilient. At the same time, I think I mentioned that a good question to ask about new programs is it allowing us to think across silos? Is it allowing us to not just replace in kind, but to consider the impacts in these different scenarios? And I think there's a lot of effort as we struggle to find financing for infrastructure to think about insurance premiums and can we invest in a way that we capture a lowering of insurance premiums is very hard to do. At some point, there needs to be federal policy.
And finally, and I'll also direct this one to you, Mike, as well. In particular, it says governments appear to underspend on maintenance and repair in particular. Yeah, I mean, one reason why I think we even have such a high ROI in general in the model is partly because of maintenance and repair often has very high ROI when averaged in. So is this, in your experience, Mike, is this true that cool new projects often get funded more than just boring, maintenance and repair, even though that might actually have very high ROI? And what do you think is kind of the reason behind that, if that's true?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Anecdotally, I think it's true in many cases. The federal program actually is a good example of that incentive. The federal program tends to support new capital investment, not operations and maintenance. I think from a voter policy standpoint also, it's a lot less tangible. It's also a lot less, it can be more difficult to hold people responsible for actually making the repairs. But this is an area I think where business management and analytics actually offer a lot of opportunities too for us to get better data about the state of our infrastructure and to make better capital allocation decisions between operations and maintenance and replacement. Yeah. But I think part of that is the funding programs can be predicated specifically on one type of use. Yeah. And a lot of what we do is color of money and how do you actually unlock funds that are not necessarily fungible.
Yeah, and I think it's an important question because empirically it does seem maintenance often has a very high ROI, and yet it doesn't get the glamour, and the federal backs up. Excellent. We ran a few minutes over. I do want to keep on pace, so we're going to take maybe a 10-minute break here, and then we're going to move on to our next panel, which is going to be on some cutting-edge tools, very cool stuff on how to use machine learning to do look at regulatory overlap, and then as well as what was blockchain, which is becoming hotter in state and local governments. What can it do and not do? But in the meantime, let me please join me in thanking John and Michael.
Thanks very much.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll ring the chime in just a few minutes here, and we'll try to get you out.